It happened in an instant. Tucker Carlson leaned forward, voice sharp as a blade, slicing into Jasmine Crockett's words before she could finish her thought. "No, no, no," he snapped, his interruption laced with the smug confidence of a man used to control. The panel chuckled along with him, a chorus of dismissive laughter echoing his authority. For a moment it seemed like the familiar script was playing out once again. The seasoned television titan steamrolling a guest, the room tilting in his favor. But then came the silence, a silence so heavy it pulled at the air. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She simply held her ground, her eyes steady, her posture calm, her presence unshaken by the noise. The interruption had landed, yes. But what no one realized yet was that it had also cracked open the stage for something unforgettable. The cameras caught every flicker, Tucker's smirk stretching wider, the panelists leaning in, expecting her to stumble or retreat. They'd seen this dance before and they knew the ending, or so they thought. Viewers at home could feel the imbalance, a rising tension between arrogance and composure, between a man who thrived on cutting people down and a woman who was about to show what real strength looked like. Crockett's pause wasn't weakness, it was calculation. She let the weight of his interruption hang in the air until it almost collapsed under its own arrogance. Then, with a calm steadiness that felt almost cinematic, she prepared her reply. You could almost hear hearts pounding. In the studio, in living rooms across the country, anywhere people had ever been talked over, dismissed, or mocked for daring to speak. This wasn't just another segment on cable TV. This was a test of dignity against a culture of spectacle. And while Tucker thought he had seized control, in truth, he had set the trap for himself. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to say would not only stop him cold, it would ripple far beyond that studio. And as the world leaned closer to its screens, waiting for the clash to explode, no one knew the shockwave about to come. Because Tucker Carlson wasn't ready for Jasmine Crockett's clapback, and neither was his panel. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to step back and see the battlefield Tucker Carlson thought he had already won. He wasn't just hosting a panel. He was staging a performance, a spectacle designed to control the narrative. Tucker had spent years perfecting this art. Frame the question, interrupt the answer, deliver the smirk that told his audience who was clever and who was not. And for his loyal viewers, it worked. The interruption was the trick, the weapon, the way he kept the upper hand. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't an ordinary guest. She wasn't the politician who showed up nervous and eager to please. She wasn't the academic caught off guard by Tucker's rapid-fire jabs. Crockett carried something different into that studio, not just her voice, but the weight of communities, who had been silenced, talked over, and erased. Every word she spoke represented people who never got invited to sit at tables like this. And Tucker, perhaps blinded by his own confidence, didn't see it coming. The stakes in that moment stretched, far beyond television ratings. It wasn't simply about whether Crockett could get her point across. It was about whether dignity could withstand interruption, whether truth could pierce through a machine built on mockery. Every immigrant family watching, every young activist tuning in, every person who had ever been told to stay in their place felt the tension. Would she fold under the weight of arrogance, or would she turn that very arrogance into fuel? Tucker thought he knew the ending. He thought his interruption was the climax, but in reality it was only the spark. Because Crockett's calm pause wasn't silence, it was strategy, the kind of strategy born from years of fighting uphill battles, years of refusing to be dismissed. And in that stillness, the balance began to shift. The panel didn't sense it yet. They leaned back in their chairs, smirking, expecting the segment to continue along the usual script. But the viewers at home, the ones who had felt the sting of dismissal themselves, saw something in her eyes. It was composure. It was resolve. It was the promise that she wouldn't just answer Tucker. She would flip his interruption into a moment so sharp, so unshakable that even his own panel would be stunned. And that's why this wasn't just television. This was about America's bigger argument. Who gets to speak and who gets cut off? Who gets to dominate the conversation and who refuses to be silenced? In that studio, under those lights, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending her point. She was standing in for everyone who'd ever been interrupted, laughed at, or ignored. Tucker didn't know it yet, but the very tactic that had built his career, the interruption, was about to become the reason this moment would define him. Because the stakes weren't just about a debate. They were about who we are willing to listen to, and whose voices we can no longer afford to dismiss. And as Crockett inhaled, steady and unbroken, the stage was set. The next words out of her mouth wouldn't just reclaim her time. They would change the entire trajectory of the debate. What happened next didn't just surprise Tucker Carlson. It shook his entire panel. For years, Tucker Carlson had built his empire on interruption. His brand wasn't simply commentary, it was dominance. He knew how to lean in, raise his eyebrows, and slice through a guest's words with a dismissive laugh that told the audience all they needed to know. To his followers, Tucker was more than a broadcaster. He was the voice that mocked the establishment, skewered his opponents, and always seemed one step ahead. But behind that polished image was a playbook, a method perfected over decades of turning conversation into confrontation. Tucker's rise wasn't an accident. He understood the camera like few others did. He learned that smirks travel faster than facts, that a well-timed interruption creates the illusion of superiority. He became the man who could take any subject, any guest, and twist the energy of the exchange until he stood tall while the other side looked small. He thrived on spectacle, and spectacle rewarded him. Night after night, viewers tuned in, not for policy, not for substance, but for the show, the Carlson performance, complete with sighs, eye rolls, and that signature chuckle when an opponent faltered. But here's what most never saw. Behind the confidence was an insecurity so sharp it demanded control at all costs. Interruption wasn't just a tactic, it was armor. If Tucker kept talking, if he kept the floor, then no one else could land a blow. If he framed the question and cut off the answer, then the debate never had a chance to expose weakness. He wasn't just debating ideas. He was managing image, ensuring that his dominance was never questioned. That's why Jasmine Crockett's presence was such a threat. Tucker was used to certain kinds of opponents, academics who wilted under pressure, politicians desperate to avoid a soundbite, commentators too polite to push back. But Crockett was different. She didn't come to the table to win Tucker's approval. She came armed with the kind of conviction born from lived experience, the kind of clarity that interruptions only sharpen rather than dull. The irony was that Tucker couldn't help himself. He saw an opportunity for the classic move. Cut her off, throw her off balance, and let the audience laugh along. It had worked 100 times before. It had built his brand. Yet it was that very instinct, the need to interrupt, to dominate, to remind his viewers of who held the power, that would set him up for failure. Because interruption has a fatal flaw. It assumes the other person won't know how to wield it against you. It assumes the pause will be filled with embarrassment. The stumble will confirm your superiority. But when faced with someone like Crockett, interruption becomes a trap. Every second Tucker tried to take away only deepened the anticipation for what she would do next. And this wasn't just about two individuals locked in debate. Tucker represented something larger, a culture that thrives on belittling, on talking over, on turning political dialogue into theater where the loudest wins. He had come to embody the arrogance of that system, its reliance on domination rather than discussion. Millions saw him as untouchable because he controlled the tempo of every exchange. But that night, in that studio, his playbook was about to collide with someone who didn't play by his rules. The panel around him fed into the illusion. They laughed when he smirked. They nodded when he interrupted, as if the hierarchy of the stage was set in stone. And Tucker believed it too. He leaned forward, ready to enjoy yet another effortless takedown, convinced that his interruption had done the work. But arrogance is a dangerous companion. It blinds you to the moment when control begins to slip. It convinces you that history can't be rewritten, even as the pen is moving in someone else's hand. Tucker Carlson, the man who built his career on controlling the story, had just given Jasmine Crockett the opening to write her own. And while the panel still thought they were watching the same old show, the audience at home sensed the shift. They saw the arrogance, the smirk, the interruption, and they felt something brewing. They knew deep down that the stage was tilting. What Tucker had perfected over decades was about to unravel in a single exchange. Because across from him sat someone who wasn't just there to survive his tactics. She was ready to dismantle them, and the moment she opened her mouth, everything changed. Long before she stepped into that studio with Tucker Carlson, Jasmine Crockett had been fighting battles in rooms far less glamorous and far more unforgiving. Her story didn't begin under bright lights. It began in neighborhoods where voices went unheard, in courtrooms where the odds were stacked, and in communities where dignity was often treated like a luxury. She wasn't born into power. She carved her way into it, armed with resilience, wit, and an unshakable refusal to be silenced. Crockett's roots are not the kind that make headlines, but they are the kind that make a person unbreakable. Raised with a deep awareness of what justice should look like and how often it fails the people who need it most, she grew up understanding that the world does not hand out fairness. You fight for it, or you watch it get stolen. She chose to fight. Before politics, there was law. As a defense attorney, she spent long nights poring over case files that most would dismiss. She represented the overlooked, the ones society would rather forget. Each case hardened her resolve, teaching her how to face intimidation without blinking. Judges cut her off. Prosecutors tried to rattle her. Courtrooms became training grounds for composure under fire. Every time someone tried to talk over her, she learned how to sharpen her arguments until they cut deeper than any interruption ever could. It wasn't glamorous. It was grueling. But it was also preparation. Preparation for a world where voices like hers weren't just challenged, they were actively suppressed. And through it all, she carried a quiet truth. Being underestimated was her greatest advantage. When Crockett entered politics, she brought that same courtroom fire with her. She didn't arrive as a polished insider rehearsing safe talking points. She arrived as a fighter, unafraid of confrontation, unwilling to dilute her truth for comfort. In legislative chambers, she became known for cutting through grandstanding with precision. Critics painted her as too direct, too bold, too unwilling to play the game. Supporters, however, saw something else, a leader who wasn't there to blend in but to break through. And that's what made her different from Tucker Carlson and the panels he surrounded himself with. Tucker thrived on performance, on appearances that reinforced his control. Crockett thrived on authenticity, on speaking with a conviction that couldn't be staged. Her power didn't come from dominance, it came from resilience. From a life spent in arenas where she wasn't supposed to win but did anyway, she carried into that studio not just her resume, but the weight of countless experiences. The client who cried when she defended their dignity in court, the constituent who thanked her for standing firm in the legislature, the young activists who looked up to her as proof that voice can pierce through noise. Every interruption she had ever endured, every dismissal she had ever faced was packed into her presence that night. And there was another layer too: identity. Jasmine Crockett represented communities that Tucker and his audience often painted in caricatures. She embodied the pride of being unapologetically herself, a black woman in politics, standing tall against forces that thrived on erasure. For many watching, her very existence at that table was already an act of defiance. The interruption wasn't just aimed at her words, it was aimed at everything she represented. And she knew it. But Crockett had long since learned to turn attacks into ammunition. She didn't shy away from being the target. She leaned into it, flipping the narrative until what was meant to diminish her only made her stronger. It was the courtroom lesson all over again. Control the pause, own the silence, and let the opponent's arrogance set them up for their own unraveling. So when Tucker Carlson interrupted her, she didn't just hear a rude cutoff. She heard opportunity. Opportunity to showcase not only her argument, but her strength, her story, her refusal to let arrogance define the moment. For Tucker, it was just another tactic. For Crockett, it was the opening she had been prepared for her entire career. And the audience, both in the studio and across the nation, felt that history in her silence. They saw not hesitation, but a lifetime of resilience converging into one poised response. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician on a panel, she was a survivor of battles that Tucker couldn't even imagine. And those battles had forged a composure that no interruption could shake. That night, she wasn't just defending herself. She was standing in for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been talked over, everyone who had ever been told that their dignity was optional. Her story wasn't just her own. It belonged to the countless people who saw themselves in her. And that is why what happened next mattered so much. Because when the moment came to answer Tucker Carlson's interruption, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just responding as an individual. She was carrying the weight of a lifetime and a community onto the stage. The pause was over. The stage was hers, and the escalation was about to begin. The tension in the studio was electric. Tucker Carlson had just done what he always do. He cut off his guest mid-sentence, confident that his voice alone would set the rhythm. The panel smirked along, chuckling softly, almost rehearsed in their approval. To them, this was nothing new. Tucker interrupts. The guest stumbles. The panel reinforces the mockery, and the show moves on with Tucker in control. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stumbling. She sat there, her composure unbroken, letting the interruption breathe just long enough to make everyone wonder what was coming next. That silence, so small, so subtle, began to tilt the balance of the room. Tucker leaned in, ready to press his advantage, his words quick, sharp, dismissive. He tried to box her in, firing questions not to hear answers but to overwhelm. It was his signature: flood the space with noise until the other voice disappears. Yet Crockett refused to disappear. With every attempt Tucker made to dominate, she grew calmer, steadier, as if each interruption only clarified her resolve. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. Instead, she waited for the opening and when she spoke, her words cut through the chatter like a blade. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried. It demanded attention. The panel, sensing the shift, tried to pile on. One voice mocked her point. Another laughed as though dismissing her was a group effort. It was a familiar chorus, one designed to overwhelm and humiliate. But Crockett's eyes didn't waver. She turned from Tucker to the panel and back again, making it clear she wasn't there to entertain their performance. She was there to deliver truth, and she wasn't about to let noise bury it. What made the moment so gripping was not just what she said, but how she held herself. The panel's laughter seemed smaller against her poise. Tucker's smirk felt thinner each time she calmly countered. The dynamic was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, and the audience at home could feel. Even this wasn't the usual spectacle where the loudest voice triumphed. This was something different. And then Tucker tried one more time. He cut her off mid-sentence, voice dripping with condescension, as if to remind everyone that he was still the master of this stage. But the arrogance in his interruption was too much, too obvious. It backfired. Because instead of rattling her, it gave Crockett the perfect moment, the exact cue she needed to deliver her clapback. The escalation had reached its peak. Tucker had spent every ounce of his control, every smirk, every interruption, every chuckle from the panel. And Jasmine Crockett had absorbed it all, waiting, biding her time, holding steady until the perfect second to strike. The room leaned. Bort. The panel, still smirking, didn't see what was coming. Tucker, mid-interruption, didn't sense the trap he had set for himself. But the audience, the audience knew. They had felt the storm building in her silence, in her composure, in the way she had refused to be reduced to background noise. And when she finally opened her mouth, the clapback wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a turning point. The escalation was over. The counterattack was about to begin. The interruption hung in the air, thick with arrogance. Tucker Carlson had leaned in one more time, cutting Jasmine Crockett mid-thought, smirk plastered on his face as though he'd already won. The panel chuckled softly, the kind of chuckle that comes from certainty. Certainty that they'd seen this play out before. Certainty that the guest would fold under pressure. Certainty that Tucker's control was unshakable. But Crockett didn't fold. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she let Tucker's interruption echo for a heartbeat too long, until the laughter began to feel hollow, until the smugness curdled into silence. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and sharp as glass. "You can interrupt me all you want, Tucker, but what you can't do is erase the truth." The studio shifted. The panel's chuckles died in their throats, replaced by a silence that landed heavier than the interruption itself. Tucker's smirk faltered just slightly, not gone, but no longer effortless. The camera zoomed in, catching his blink, the flicker of recognition that he had miscalculated. Crockett didn't waste the moment. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Tucker, her words carrying the weight of everyone who'd ever been cut off, ignored, or dismissed. "You invite people like me on this show because you think you can control the conversation, but you don't get to decide who matters. You don't get to decide whose voice gets heard, and you certainly don't get to silence me." The power of her clapback wasn't in volume. It was in precision. Each word landed like a hammer, deliberate and undeniable. She didn't shout him down, she dismantled him piece by piece, exposing the arrogance behind his interruption for what it was, weakness disguised as strength. Tucker tried to jump back in, tried to laugh it off, but the timing was gone. His interruption no longer felt commanding. It felt desperate, like a man clinging to a script that had already been rewritten. The panel shifted uncomfortably, their smirks frozen, as though unsure whether to laugh or retreat. Crockett pressed on. "You've made a career out of mocking, out of talking over, out of turning debate into a circus. But the difference between you and me is this. I'm not here for performance, I'm here for truth. And truth doesn't need a smirk. It doesn't need an interruption. It stands on its own." A murmur rippled through the audience. At home, viewers felt the jolt, that spark of recognition when someone speaks the words you've been waiting to hear. Social media timelines lit up instantly, clips of her words spreading before the segment had even finished airing. Tucker leaned back, eyebrows raised, searching for the next move. But every attempt at recovery only exposed the crack. When he tried to chuckle, it sounded forced. When he tried to frame a new question, it sounded hollow. Crockett had seized the floor, and no amount of interruption could take it back. And then came the line. The one that would be clipped, replayed, and shared across the internet within minutes. She fixed her gaze on him and said, "If your only power is the power to interrupt, then you never had power at all." The room froze. Tucker blinked, the panel's silence deafening. For the first time in the segment, Tucker Carlson wasn't leading the performance. Jasmine Crockett was. That single line hit harder than any shouted argument could. It exposed the emptiness of his tactic, the fragility behind the smirk. And in that instant, the dynamic flipped completely. Tucker, once the unshakable host, looked small, while Crockett, calm and unflinching, towered over the entire exchange. What made it unforgettable wasn't just the takedown itself. It was the way it resonated. For every viewer who had ever been cut off in a meeting, dismissed in a classroom, silenced at a family table, Crockett's words carried vindication. She had turned interruption, a tool of dominance, into proof of weakness. The panel scrambled to recover. One member tried to pivot with a half-hearted joke, but it fell flat. Another attempted to challenge her point, but Crockett cut through with the same precision, dismantling the argument with ease. Each rebuttal was calm, measured, devastating. The balance of power had shifted, and no one could deny it. By the time Tucker tried to wrap the segment, it was too late. The story had already been written, and it wasn't the one he wanted. Viewers wouldn't remember his interruptions. They wouldn't remember his smirks. They would remember the moment Jasmine Crockett, calm and unwavering, delivered the line that stripped his performance bare. And in the hours that followed, that line would ricochet across the country, replayed in clips, celebrated in posts, dissected in commentary. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a cultural moment, a mic drop that echoed far beyond the studio walls. Tucker Carlson had walked into the debate believing he controlled the stage. But in trying to silence her, he had handed Jasmine Crockett the microphone, and she used to deliver a takedown so sharp, so undeniable, that even his panel couldn't hide their shock. The exchange was over. The clapback had landed, but the story was only beginning, because what happened next didn't stay in the studio. It exploded across the nation. The clip hit the internet before the studio lights had even cooled. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's words were everywhere, flooding timelines and dominating feeds. That single line, "If your only power is the power to interrupt, then you never had power at all," spread like wildfire. It was clipped, subtitled, remixed, turned into memes and stitched into TikToks. People who had never even watched Tucker Carlson's show were suddenly replaying the moment on loop, nodding with satisfaction as Crockett's calm voice cut through the arrogance of the panel. Twitter lit up first. Hashtags like "Yo Crockett Clapback" and "Dignity Wins" trended by the hour. Activists praised her composure. Commentators dissected the precision of her words, and ordinary viewers shared their own stories of being talked over, each post turning her rebuttal into a rallying cry. One tweet with 1 million views summed, "Get up." Tucker tried to silence her, but she silenced him instead. The memes followed quickly. Side-by-side screenshots of Tucker's fading smirk next to Crockett's steady gaze flooded Instagram. TikTok creators layered her words over dramatic music, cutting from Tucker's interruption to Crockett's line, as though it were the climax of a blockbuster film. Late-night comedians seized on the moment, playing the clip for roaring audiences, who cheered as if they had been in the studio themselves. But it wasn't just entertainment. The political ripple effect was immediate. Commentators on both sides weighed in, but the contrast was clear. Progressive voices celebrated the exchange as a rare moment where dignity triumphed over arrogance, where substance cut through spectacle. Even some moderates who didn't align with Crockett politically admitted they were struck by her composure. Conservative allies of Tucker tried to spin it, framing her as overly dramatic or too sensitive, but the attempt fell flat. The clip spoke louder than any spin could. Crockett herself said little in the immediate aftermath, letting the moment speak for her. That restraint only amplified the impact. She didn't need to double down or over-explain. She had already won, in the most public way possible. Every additional replay of the clip cemented her as the victor of the exchange. What made the moment resonate so deeply was that it tapped into something universal. People had lived versions of this scene in their own lives. A boss who cut them off, a teacher who dismissed their question, a relative who mocked their perspective. Seeing Tucker interrupted Crockett, and then watching her flip the script with such calm precision, felt like collective vindication. She had spoken not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Celebrities chimed in. A-list. Actors tweeted their admiration, musicians praised her mic drop energy, and activists highlighted the deeper meaning of her words. News outlets replayed the clip endlessly, with pundits marveling at how a single sentence could so thoroughly dismantle one of television's most seasoned performers. The narrative was clear. Tucker Carlson had finally met a guest he couldn't control. Meanwhile, younger audiences took the moment and ran with it. On college campuses, the line was quoted in student speeches. At protests, it appeared on handmade signs. In classrooms, teachers replayed the exchange as an example of composure under pressure. The clapback had transcended the studio. It had become a cultural reference point, and yet the most telling response came from Tucker himself. In the following days, he tried to brush it off, dismissing Crockett's words as grandstanding, but his usual bravado rang hollow. The internet had already decided the verdict. His interruption, once his weapon, had been turned against him. His smirk, once his armor, had become a meme. His dominance, once unquestioned, was suddenly in doubt. The shockwaves of that moment revealed something bigger than a single clash. They revealed how quickly arrogance can collapse under the weight of truth, how fragile dominance looks when met with dignity. Crockett had not only won an exchange, She had shifted a narrative, and that shift carried a lesson, one that was just beginning to crystallize. Because while the internet buzzed with laughter and applause, Crockett herself understood the deeper meaning. This wasn't only about Tucker Carlson. It was about what kind of voices America was finally ready to hear. And as the applause grew, louder, as the hashtags swelled and the memes multiplied, one question loomed. What would this moment teach us about the power of dignity in a world addicted to noise? In the days that followed, as the viral dust began to settle, the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's Clapback revealed itself. For many, it wasn't simply about a television segment or a single victory in a battle of words. It was about what her response symbolized: dignity standing tall against arrogance, truth outlasting noise, and composure defeating chaos. The power of her line lay not in its cleverness, but in its clarity. She hadn't shouted Tucker down. She hadn't matched his arrogance with arrogance. She had simply drawn a boundary, a line of truth that exposed how flimsy his interruptions really were. That calm declaration, if your only power is the power to interrupt, then you never had power at all, became more than a comeback. It became a principle, and people carried it with them. Workers shared it when describing unfair bosses. Students repeated it after classroom debates. Parents taught it to their children as a lesson in self-respect. It wasn't just Crockett's voice anymore. It was a shared anthem, echoing in the lives of those who needed it most. What resonated so deeply was the moral clarity of the moment. It reminded people that dignity is not weakness. Too often, calmness is mistaken for silence, patience for submission, and respect for fragility. Crockett shattered that illusion. She showed that dignity is power, perhaps the most unshakable kind, because it cannot be stolen by mockery or interruption. Even more, her moment reframed the debate on what leadership looks like. For years, the loudest voice in the room was assumed to be the strongest. The person who cut others off, who filled silence with bluster, was treated as the one in control. But Crockett flipped that script. She proved that the strongest leader is the one who refuses to be baited, who commands attention not by raising their volume but by raising their standard. And in that, there was a distinctly American lesson, because the story of America, at its best, is not about the bully who drowns out others, but about the dignity of voices that refuse to be silenced. It is the immigrant who speaks their truth despite jeers. It is the activist who holds their ground despite threats. It is the everyday citizen who insists that their perspective matters, even when the world tries to talk over them. Crockett's Clapback was more than a personal triumph. It was a reflection of that broader struggle, and a reminder that the future belongs to those who stand in their truth with dignity. As commentators continued to replay the moment, some noted that Tucker Carlson had faced countless guests, yet few had ever shifted the dynamic so thoroughly. And the reason was simple. While others tried to fight him on his terms, louder, sharper, angrier, Crockett didn't. She fought on hers. She didn't try to own the noise. She let it expose itself, then revealed the hollowness underneath. That is why her victory rang so loudly. It wasn't about clever rhetoric. It was about integrity. It was about showing that even in the most hostile environments, one can remain true, unshaken, and unbroken. And that lesson rippled outward, inspiring those who watched to ask themselves, how do I respond when I am interrupted? How do I carry myself when arrogance tries to drown me out? What would it look like if, like Crockett, I chose dignity over anger, composure over chaos? The answers to those questions would vary for each person, but the principle was clear. True power is not in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your spirit. And that is the moral that Crockett left with the nation, one that no interruption could erase, because in the end, her moment on Tucker's stage wasn't just a debate victory. It was a revelation. Dignity doesn't just win arguments, it defines history. So here we are, at the end of a moment that was so much bigger than a single exchange on television. What began as yet another Tucker Carlson interruption turned into something unforgettable, a lesson etched into the national conversation. Jasmine Crockett showed the country that dignity can not only survive arrogance, it can eclipse it. And that's why this story matters to you. Because this wasn't just about Tucker and Crockett. It was about every one of us who has ever been talked over, dismissed, mocked, or underestimated. Her calm defiance wasn't just her victory, it was ours. She proved that power built on noise collapses the moment it faces truth spoken with clarity. The question is, what do we do with that? Do we let this be just another viral clip, a moment of entertainment, quickly replaced by the next outrage? Or do we take it as a spark, a reminder of how we can choose to carry ourselves when the world tries to silence us? This channel exists for that reason, to take these moments, dramatize them, and show their deeper meaning, so that we don't just watch, we learn, and we grow stronger together. So if this story struck a chord with you, if you felt that surge of validation watching Jasmine Crockett hold her ground, then don't let it stop here. Join this community. Subscribe. Share this video. Become part of a movement that insists on dignity, truth, and courage in the face of arrogance. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the interruptions. It remembers the voices that refuse to be silenced. And Crockett reminded us all of that truth.